Cool. So we were just talking about the transpersonal realm. And I love that you went there. What I was going to say is that you had mentioned writing your book and taking out your spirituality in that writing. But I would be curious as to why, because I think the spirituality goes along with the voice and your telling of your interpretation of creative process. Because for me, spirituality and accessing the transpersonal realm and working from that liminal space are kind of intertwined.
Okay, well, part of what my intention is with writing this book is it's not so much about trying to understand where I'm coming from with the relationship to creativity. It's trying to understand a broader kind of relationship with creativity. And I understand that the individual is going to have a different relationship with that. So I'm approaching it in a much more objective way as opposed to subjective. I'm using my subjective experience to kind of guide the things that I'm, the little insights and things that I have to offer. But I'm trying to tap into the collective mind a little bit. And so I understand, that, some artists, this is really about an artist's approach to their position in a very modern world. So, some artists, they don't have that thing that you and I were just talking about moments ago, where it's this intoxicating experience when this entity called inspiration kind of comes in and takes over. Like some artists they don't really, they have a totally different relationship with it. It's it doesn't pull them out of reality. It's there, and it helps cue them into what they're going to work on next, but it's not necessarily something that takes them out of reality. And so I'm just trying to, I feel like if I was to start interjecting my own very personal beliefs, that I wouldn't be speaking to everybody anymore.
I find that really interesting, because I think part of the process of really embodying being an artist or a writer or someone pulling all of this out of the ether, it really involves finding your own creative authority and your voice. And so for me, we were talking about this before, but for me, finding that artistry and that embodied role really happens in the revision stages and in my discernment of what's going to say in the piece. And of course I work mostly with writing, but I have to, so it's interesting to hear an external version of creative process and artistry, and then my own version and how I kind of measure myself against that.
Well, I'll add just real quick, because I think you're talking about, not inhibiting yourself during the creative process. I don't do that with my paintings. I'm a visual artist. My paintings, I just go for it. But I'm writing a nonfiction book, and I'm trying to speak to everybody. So I imagine with your fiction work and your autofiction, you wouldn't want to have any of those kinds of boundaries either, right?
Yeah, I love the potentiality of creativity. I love not having any boundaries or any direction, except maybe just an impulse. And I often start from scene. I kind of have to work backwards to find a story. So I start visually, but then I write into that space of potentiality and not really knowing either. And I find that it's interesting that I have a hard time getting into character. You know, like I think sometimes people, when they're writing or in their writing flow, like, you know, they start becoming like the person, maybe like feel their mannerisms or something, and writing from that point of view gives a really authentic character creation. And I'm not that. I'm always like working toward the bigger picture of what the work wants to be. And so it like, because I'm always playing with language and temporal and spatial experience.
You have such a unique style in that way. You really, you kind of shatter like those barriers. I think it's great what you do.
Thanks. You know, I have to give credit, you know, where credit's due, and especially like Irvine Welsh being like a major inspiration, and it's kind of like stream of consciousness books. But I want to do that because part of like the bigger picture of what I'm interested in is language, is relating to another person using the currency of language, maybe catalyzing or like invoking some kind of a change or even reaction, or just, you know, because like we're dynamic beings, and just the words, the stories that we tell each other, and the tone of the word, and like, you know, the pacing, the volume, anything being conveyed through language. Like I want to know what that is doing for the other person, like the reader, listener, reader, writer experience. And by playing with my stories, with playing with different shapes and like a lot of stuff that frankly doesn't even work. Like it's you know, but I want to do that because I want to expand and explore those spaces, say expand consciousness a little bit. So I think what I love about your version or what you're putting forth as art is because like I know that what I get from your art, and I think that like there's a difference between me weirdly being obsessed with words and like having to like construct, like, you know, you do so many like things that you use, you know, how many thousands of pages have I just like, you know, talked.
Yeah.
So I was like, I don't know what
all
that
these
was.
different configurations and yeah.
So like my obsession is like putting out art in this manner, and my reasons for creating it are just like wanting to explore more of that innocent space or space plus that innocence. But then I don't know what people take from
That's so valuable. I think that's such a great, you know, a great thing that you're bringing up is like, okay, to what point do we just need to explore like the wilderness of our own creativity, as abstract as that might come across to the audience? And then to what point do we want to be an effective communicator so that, you know, like the message is actually received? And I think it's a balance. I think it's really important to sometimes do the first thing, which is, you know, do that exploring, you know, don't hold yourself back, but then maybe come back to where you can communicate that. But I don't know. I guess it kind of depends. What do you think? Like, depending on the situation, or what do you think is most important, or do you think it's possible to have a balance between the two?
I don't know, you know, because it fundamentally changes the work, I think, in two ways. I think number one, if you want to throw it into the market, or you need to capitalize on your time, you need to sell your painting. Like if money is your motivator, I think the final result will reflect a little bit of the market. I mean, some people don't care.
Sure.
Like I'm
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to like, I'm not trying to do that, you know. I don't
No,
have
but like if I sell something,
becoming
like,
rich off my art.
no,
Yeah.
but so that's the thing, and that's the second piece. I'm thinking of over the summer, I had gone to an art museum. I think it was in Germany, in Southwest Germany, and they were having a Mondrian retrospective, and it was glorious. And he talked about, are you painting the abstraction because that's more real than the real thing? Or do you paint the real thing because that's how your mind has abstracted it? Like the real thing that you see is how your mind is putting it out there. So I think that was just so gosh darn interesting when it comes to like, it comes down to the core question, like, what are you creating? And can you let that go for the viewers or readers experience? Or maybe you just know that, you know, and the other person might Google your work for different reasons, you know. And that actually makes me think of that book, one of the books I had mentioned to you, True Perception, The Path of Dharma Art. Chogyam Trungpa. Like he talks about the artistic mind, the egoic mind, the spiritual mind, you know, the mind reflecting what is in it. So if you're making art that's going to reflect a lot of trauma or ego, like you're just putting that out there. But when you start to reflect, your mind is clear and you can reflect the beauty of the trees, the beauty of the community of you that you live in, when that's what you're putting back out there, you know, these images, reflections of your ecosystem, like this is kind of flowing like in a spiritual form of art. And that goes back to what we were talking about. Like, are you creating it or are you just like pushing it through, you know, like it actually makes me think of, I think what might have initiated our discussion a couple months ago was that I had gone to this poetry reading in a dive bar. Cool. It's New Orleans, you know, one wall's got like, you know, an aluminum sheet or one of those like foil sheets hanging up to cover a hole and like, you know, super divey, Christmas lights in July. But this poetry series was being sponsored by poets and writers. It was a very well-attended event, and most people there were just talking about how awful going to readings was and how awful, like, you know, having to go out, you know, to do these things. And I was just like, I don't understand. Now, I do know other artists, and you know, sometimes, you know, like, I've gone with some artist friends who weren't really keen on going to an opening or like didn't want to do the social thing. Okay, I get it.
Yeah. There's this stuffiness, you know, they feel like it's more about being seen than it is, because it's fun to go to a gallery when you're in your private space and you can just kind of like privately check out the art and have your own experience with it. But the whole social function can feel a little pressured for sure.
Yeah, and I understand that. I just thought it was really interesting in relation to art. And so now this night it was poetry, and I mean, it was some pretty raunchy and just like what sounded like incredibly cathartic words, and it was great. And I do like how you are highlighting the difference or your separation of church and state, spirituality and art, because like in this case, I don't separate the art of writing from spirituality, but being there and just observing the conversations, etc. It just really made me like feel like, oh, this is the egoic mind, and not that it's bad or good, but this is, you know, like what's being shown here is like a skewed perception. There's a lot of ego in this art. So, and of course, me and my background in transpersonal psychology and like looking at stuff from a depth perspective, all the studying and the learning that I've been doing has this exploration like so rich. So that's why everything will always come down to like the psychological framework in my world.
Yeah. I was going to ask you something, and now I'm forgetting what that was.
I'm gonna have my cold espresso coffee.
And my one last little sip of wine. So
Are you
good.
drinking with a straw?
I am.
That's
Because-
amazing.
Well, I'm not always this white trash. It's because of the. It's because of that teeth thing I was telling you about. The aligners, and you're not supposed to smoke or drink anything other than water when you're wearing them. But
Oh, I don't follow those rules. No. Like, no. You asked me to wear this stuff 22 hours a day. Okay. But so, so one thing that I've been thinking about actively, and I don't know if I've shared this with you, but thinking about this kind of like spectrum of art and like where the creator falls on the spectrum of what they're trying to do, and the spirituality of it. Oh, okay. So also in this book, I mean, it's a tenet of spiritual life to achieve clarity of mind. And the Yoga Sutras, there's sutras or little aphorisms that talk about perception and how you are the perceiver and also the object that is being perceived, so the super clear mind. But one thing it doesn't account for is like being human and like life sucks sometimes. And a lot of people use art to kind of like drain their brain and like
for sure
express stuff. And that's totally where I go with autofiction. Diving into potentiality. Yes, it makes me feel better to write about myself as a 60-year-old woman with a kid than it does to write about myself as a 41-year-old single self. No child.
Yeah.
Included.
I mean, go ahead.
Where was I going with that? Oh, so like, I think for the people who like just use art in their raw form, especially outsider artists or people who aren't identifying as artists and they're just using it in this form of like transformation and growth, like that to me even has a spiritual purpose. And growing, expanding consciousness, like working through different versions of yourself, and what that art also kind of expels out of you, to me is a really beautiful spiritual process. And so in that way, I kind of like egoic art. So yeah, and just to close the poetry reading story, I was just really weirded out by it, and I had to think about it and why people would be so like glib about art. And
because it sounds like it was a pretty cool event.
Oh, it totally was. And I've gone to more since, and I've gone to other readings where, like you're too cool for school, But I left that day, and it was in the Marigny on the east side of New Orleans. And I was walking down St. Claude Ave, which can be not nice. And it was just, dusk. And I was like, this is not a good idea, but whatever. But I really went into a deep internal meditation as I was walking, and I was just feeling like radiating love, bhakti love. And as I was walking, it's just kind of feeling my heart be very open. I mean, the poetry was wonderful. My heart felt very open afterward. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that like I was really touched by the art that transpired. So then I start to then who the heck are you to say like this is art and this is not art? If this affected you, then like okay, then it affected you, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's why it's been so challenging writing about art, because it's I think its functions are constantly shifting and are very contextual depending on the creator and the audience and the environment, you know, and the need too. So art serves a lot of different purposes depending on the spiritual need. I believe it's always a spiritual thing. I will say that, you know, art is always going to be a spiritual expression, but how it affects different people is, you know, it's going to be on different levels. Sometimes people just need to see something pretty and uplifting that might help get them through that moment of their day. Sometimes people need to see that kind of wild abandon, or need to create that kind of, go to that place of wild abandon while they're creating, to bring them back to their authentic subconscious selves. And then sometimes people are trying to communicate a specific message that happens to be like just the thing that that person needed to hear that day, you know? So like, it's been a very like ambiguous thing to try and write about. And that's why I've had to go out of my own biased opinions about it and into like this more like openness about all the different functions that it might be able to serve. Cause I mean, I'll be honest, I really don't like pop art. You know, I think like when Warhol did it, it served its purpose, you know, it proved a point, and we never really, I don't think we've really had any further use for it in culture. That has been my personal opinion, or personal feeling. However, as I've been investigating the subject more, I've realized, you know, I've had to put my tongue in my mouth quite a few times, because I've heard stories of how some art that I might think is not doing a job in an effective way has totally gone and changed someone else's life. So,
right.
You know, so it's such a slithery thing, and that's why I'm trying to stay as open about it as possible.
You know, and I think that's probably why I need to like fall back into psychology, because it's kind of terrifying to not, because here's this generative force, this creative force, this almost at times erotic force, because it's just like pulling into you that creative like stickiness, you know, when everything kind of sticks to you and you're like, yeah. I think that like, well, in psychosynthesis psychology that I'm studying, view the self as an active process. Your mind, so going concept of who you are, the mindset that you're in, how you're interacting with another person, what story is playing out in the, you know, running your script in the background. Self is always in flux and change. And I think this is why there's a tendency for some of my writing to kind of almost have like a little like, not tremble to it, but like I did the story Vayush, and I wrote it 5 different ways, you know, in flash pieces. And they were all just different genders of the same character of a woman fused into an asteroid floating in space. And I couldn't like really land on stuff, and I couldn't, I was like, I'm going to do all these versions. So like, there's some inherent emotion, or there's something inherently that's dynamic about good art. And so it makes me feel comforted somehow to look at that through a psychological lens, because otherwise I think I would just go crazy trying to figure out my disposition. Does that make sense? That was a whole lot of jumble. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so. Rather than trying to like mentally analyze it too much, just kind of go through follow your natural inclinations in expressing that feeling, right?
Yeah, and so and it reflects in my work. I'm looking at this lovely manuscript of High Voltage. It's not long. It's like maybe 90 pages, 12 little chapters. But there's a lot of characters and it's really tight, and it's just like it winds in inside itself, and it starts out with an old woman, ends with a young woman who's the same woman. So like they kind of just like, go through time loops, right? And then I have Keats Cooker, which is a collection of flash of my travel stories. And this is the choose your own adventure story. And I'm so obsessed with stories that don't really have like a finite end. And I think that
whole the story arc standard. Yeah. I noticed that about your work.
Yeah. And so I think that like that kind of freaks me out though. Like for a long time, what I'm saying is for a long time, I had gone to writing workshops, and I think people just didn't know how to address that. And so I was kind of like, this is bad, because I can't seem to either contain it on a page or get it all out on a page. It's one or the other. But in my worldview and in this psychology, I'm like, you know what? Leave it all up to chance and get it to a point where you feel like the story is done and it's telling. And
so I have a question for you. What do you feel is to be a greater victory when you have created a piece of art that just felt like it flowed and came out exactly as as you were feeling it, and then you have the tangible form right in front of you, and like, so you've accomplished the translation there? Or would the greater victory be that the audience's response, where they take that piece of work and they are totally able to ingest it, and then they say that, it affected them in all these beautiful ways? I mean, surely you can have both, but if you had to choose between one or the other, what do you think would be more satisfying to you?
oh my God, babe, get out of my head. This choose your own adventure situation, I think would be the most meaningful, the best. I mean, like, here's the thing. When I started High Voltage, or when I did High Voltage, I had the Activator story and the Incubadora story, which their names are changed now, but I had those two. I was like, all right, I'm doing this. I'm writing an actual book. Kind of did it, but I was really happy with it at the time. But you know what? Maybe it was because I actually sat down and did, like I just don't traditionally, like I don't do longer works. I'm getting better. I've got, nonfiction tends to be easier, but I was really happy with that. For myself. And so like, and then I mentioned working with a different editor. I've worked with, a few people, and now I really like the book. Actually, no, because I like it. Like, I still like it.
Yeah. Well, you have to. You totally have to. I guess, like, to be a little more articulate about the question is, well, yes, it always has to come from a place of you, but if it's something that you can only share with yourself, versus like sharing that joy with others, you know, and if you had to choose between the two.
Yeah, so that's the thing. So the Keats Kokoro manuscript, it's totally about the reader, the other. So I have a collection of travel stories that I had written, and they just lived on my blog and didn't really do much. And they're short, they're like flash size. So, you know, like a couple, like a dozen plus of them. And I had done a workshop on decolonizing travel writing. And I also, in that workshop, we explored like the narrative of like the white girl who needs to travel the world and find herself. And I was, you know, just fucking. So I was like, so what do I do? Like, I like my stories. I like them in flash. These are my favorite to read at open mic. And then I was like, okay, well, how can I decolonize this and say like, oh, I wasn't traveling just to be a prick. I'm traveling because, you know, I'm sojourning and I'm staying, you know. And I was like, no, you're trying too hard. So then I was like, shoot, I want to make this a choose your own adventure book because that way the reader can come with me.
Oh, wow.
These are all
That's
Latin
really neat.
Yeah, it's not so, it's a lot harder than I thought it would be, but not.
Oh, I can imagine.
I mean, it's like, what would be a meaningful story? And what am I saying about the state of like global travel as a white girl by yourself? I mean, I think the biggest thing that you take away from here is just how disconnected I am to the environment. Because, you know, like I'm in observation mode. But now that it's switched to you, the you perspective, it's a little different. But I did not see this coming. My initial response once I started to run with the choose your own adventure tactic was that I just want to like emulate the choice of like being abroad and like making choices, interacting with the people, like bringing the reader into like this interactive experience, right? And the thing is that like we all read those choose your own adventure books as a kid. I love that shit, man. Like it taught me agency, it taught me choice, it taught me like it's like a different reading experience. So then I decided, what I did not expect, I'm going to make everybody die. Like, it's not like my default, like, thing, but like, why would people not travel? Like, they think they're going to die. They think something awful is going to happen. You know, they think like, so then I realized that this art and what I wanted to say was just that, like, you go through life and you have to make choices. And whether you're out of your head because you're feeling crazy, or like you're out of your head because you can't communicate because you can't speak a language and you're in this really weird environment and you're in this like cultural situation, you know, like I want to give people choice and I want to give people a portal to face fear. If it's not fear of death, it's fear of the other. It's fear of being like, you know, like I was in Jamaica going to Venezuela and I got detained and you know, like there's a fear in getting fucking detained in Jamaica. And I'm just like, wait, what? And then I missed my flight and I wound up on the island, you know, like smoking weed with the Rastas, you know, like there's like a fear of that joy, of that like childlike, okay, well, this is what's happening for me today. So let me just do it. So I wanted that book to reflect that. Because, like, look, I can't take away the narrative that, like, I'm a white girl and I'm finding myself. And, like, I recognize things that, you know, could have been different and my experience traveling would have been different. But that's not the legacy that I want to leave with these words. I want people to, you know, like, interact and get to know the world and, like, use my words as art.
Yeah, because you're offering... by offering a true reflection of yourself that gives the audience something to latch onto, to where they might be able to learn something further about themselves. And so I see you've it sounds like a really cool way of playing with that, where you're not straying from, your real deep personal experience, but you're also you're also giving people the option to read it however they feel like reading it. And I think that's a really awesome way of dealing with art. For sure.
Thank you. I mean, if I'm not pushing boundaries, what am I even doing? I don't know,
Yeah,
exactly. You too, but you're just you're much smoother than I am. You're just I'm going to paint some stuff and do some animation stuff. La, 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 la.
Really? Oh,
amazing.
Well, if that's how it looks like on the outside, then fine, I'll take it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If it looks all buttoned up and neat on this side, there's a lot of screaming and paper shredding. And
yeah, for sure. There's a lot of me having, deep depressions and criticizing myself, and, just wondering, it's either got to be a pure, reflection of the spirit, or it's not authentic art. But then at the same time, but if it's not readable to others, then I'm also not a true artist. So I have all these conflicts all the time.
That's my $1 million question. Yours is, what is art? That's my $1 million question. But it goes back to what you were saying, what is this doing?
And I think it's we need to not be so black and white about it. We can look at it kind of like a moving organism, and it's going to move throughout its environment in different ways, however it needs to, in the most effective way. And people, there needs to be an openness about it, so that it kind of can supply whatever might be needed of it to whoever is looking for something, in it. So it should be this kind of, I should never say should, actually. That's what I've learned in trying to write about art. Don't ever say it should or it is, it just.
That must be so difficult.
Yeah.
Back it up, babe.
Yeah.
I even write like that. Oh, God.
What's that?
I don't even know if I could write like that. Or maybe in a first pass, or no, first pass, it's just everything goes.
Well, I'll state when I'm coming from a place of this is how I feel about it, or what I think, and then I'll have to counter that with really neutral language based on observation and research and things like that. So, yeah.
I have one more question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What's the deal with creative block? Do you feel like it's how do you deal with it?
I think that creative blocks are a totally natural thing. I think that they shouldn't be stigmatized. I feel like because it's such a feared thing and a resisted thing, that artists just make it that much harder on themselves. But we have to recognize that we go through cyclical shifts. One thing that I referred to in the book was my own experience with it, which is I kind of go through seasonal shifts, and it took me forever to recognize that. But I come alive in the springtime, something about the bees buzzing around and life being created. I somehow respond to that. And I'm sure a lot of artists do, but it might not be that way for everybody. And then I become sluggish in the summertime, and then I come back alive in the fall. And in the winter, it's kind of this gestation period once again. And having recognized that about myself, finally, this is just in the last couple of years, I recognized that it made me realize, like, we can't be on all the time. And so the times when we're on, we have to realize that those are times to be taken advantage of, but also we don't want to push our limits too much, because then we might create unnatural blocks for ourselves. I don't know. It's about having a healthy relationship with yourself, really, but the blocks are going to come. They're fucking natural. We can't be on all the time. So you have to realize what your body is telling you, what your mind is telling you, and go with it, flow with it. Take those block periods to be in a time of gestation where you're not delivering, there's not a lot of output happening, but you're getting input, you're resting, you're building a nest of ideas so that when you are ready to come back alive again, then you know what to do. That's my advice.
Yeah. Thank you. I need to hear that. It is really discouraging when, like, especially if you have a practice where you're doing something every day. But I don't know. I think there's merit to really just showing up and doing something and whatever, even if, you're showing up to write and you have a block and you're just like, whatever, man, F you.
But you work through it. Yeah, there's that too. Yeah, being disciplined regardless of, because we can come up with excuses all day long as to, like, oh, I've got a slight headache, I'm not going to make it into the studio today, or
or like, oh, I need to cook dinner, or oh, I need to do something.
Yeah.
And I also just want to give a shout out to, like, all the strong women behind Mostly Men artists, because, like, I'm super conscious of it. Like, I have a cleaning people now, but, like, I still cook. There's still, like, it takes a lot to live your life, to do self-care,
right?
To work, to, like, go walk the dog. I'm like, man, where did all these great artists, like, who was, like, wiping their behind for them? Like, who was, like, who got the dowry? How did, And again, of, like, 20th century artists and 19th and 20th century artists. So I'm just, like, I'm loving art culture and creative culture, but it's also, like, sometimes I get a block because I feel guilty, even though I love what I do and I eat words for breakfast. Like, there's times when I'm like, I got so much shit to do. The dog has to go to the bed. This has to go to recycling. I'm blocked just because I have stuff to do. So, doing it, like, you're doing it. Praise to you. Take a day off. Does that make sense? Like, like,
totally.
Wow, there's so much.
Yeah, it's so hard trying to figure out our own, a healthy balance within ourselves. Because it's like, you got to know when it's healthy to take that break. But then you also have to know when you're overdoing it and just procrastinating and being lazy. Right. I think your internal guidance system will tell you, like, you'll get that gnawing, like, feeling like, you need to get off your ass. You're not quite living up to your potential, and then we have to recognize when that voice is actually coming from a place of falsity, when actually, and in fact, you should be in bed resting because you have been doing way too much. So it's about being in tune with yourself constantly. I think that's what the relationship with art teaches us most, is being in tune with ourselves.
Oh, I love that so much. So much. Yeah, I mean, whatever medium, the art will teach you to be in tune with yourself. Yeah, it's such a mirror too, and how many times when, like, I'm holding a workshop or facilitating ceremony and people are using creative writing, or they're using autofiction, they're fictionalizing and writing about some scenes in their life. And, they read something and they're just like, oh shit, like this is a reflection of me. Like, oh my God, like that's art too. Like maybe that's not getting published, but like that's art too. And that's your medium. And like, yeah, so that's part of being in touch with yourself. Absolutely. Like you even get to enjoy and kind of imbibe your art and be like, oh, what is it doing for me? I'm the creator, but I'm also like the viewer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like, it's like, oh, shit.
Totally. Well, it's been just great to talk about all this stuff with another human being that's, also, searching for like, trying to get down to the bottom of this stuff, which it's not easy stuff to talk about. I'm sure we sound like bumbling fools, but at least we're trying to talk about it, right?
I know. I feel like we went above and beyond. Like some people might be like, dude, just shut up and paint the thing, right? Like, no, there's a thing. There's like, how does this fit into my world view? Because you can like expand like an accordion, or you can not and be artless and be not okay, but good luck with that. Yeah.
I mean, we're just trying to get by and do our daily things, run our errands and function, be healthy citizens of society. And while being these, really sensitive, sensitive people that are trying to then share those sensitivities with others. So yeah, I think we're, it can get confusing.
Yeah, totally, because we need to kick the elephant out of the room, take the capitalism aspect, and just create the art and do the thing and have that for yourself. And your joy and your happiness and inner peace. Yeah.
Amen.
All right. Amen. I don't know. Like, oh my God, we're nutters. All right. Bye, y'all.